history more globally and not as African American history, which is, you know, the term African American itself is problematic. I'm sorry. You know, I always say it would be different, and I would be proud to call myself African American if it included, you know, all of the people of African descent in this hemisphere. And that is to say, Brazilians would be African American, and Canadians and Cubans, but some just like the U.S. has colonized the term America for this very small part of the hemisphere. If we assent to African Americans, we participate in that same process of colonization. Yeah, we have to find a way to be American. But well, let me continue. Because, conservatism. I wanted to, since we're speaking about history, I wanted to talk about the fact that we have a person in Washington who's trying to use his authority to drag us back towards the past. And that is inherent in the term, make America great again. Again. As if America had ever been great. But the point that I wanted to make is that conservatism is always directed towards the past, toward a time when a smaller proportion of the population had access to material, political, philosophical resources. Feudal lords wished that serfs were slaves completely so that they would owe them absolutely nothing. Capitalists sometimes wish that they own the bodies and minds and not just the labor power of their workers. Racists wish that we could return to an era where black people knew their place and where the prevailing institutions relegated black people and other people of color to a status of inferiority. That's what Make America Great means. The xenophobes want immigrants to return to their homeland, even when they, the xenophobes, have rendered those homelands uninhabitable. Misogynists continue to wish that women would accept that it is their destiny to be harassed and abused. Homophobes and transphobes wish that old notions of sexuality and gender were still dominant. Oil companies wish that we had never developed an environmental consciousness that makes many of us reluctant to pollute and destroy the earth. So how can America be great again when America was never great to begin with? The Americas, all of the Americas, North and South, would not be what they are today if not for the pillaging and plundering and suppression of indigenous cultures by European colonizers. And so we should ask, was this ubiquitous violence the first sign of greatness? Colonization was complemented by slavery because they could not systematically enslave native people. They began the process of conquering Africa, beginning by robbing the continent of its human resources. And as the brilliant scholar Walter Rodney pointed out, Europe, in attempting to develop the Americas and in attempting to develop its own economies, Europe systematically underdeveloped Africa. Read his book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. Any notion that America needs to be great again assumes that the country's greatness was a function of the capacity of white people, affluent people, male people to prevail. And I think we know that justice dictates otherwise. It dictates a humane immigration policy. Justice dictates renewing DACA and moving beyond. Justice dictates dropping all consideration of a wall, lest we end up in the same situation as Israel, Palestine. Justice also dictates refraining from referring to dreamers as lazy, like John Kelly did last week. And if you don't realize the racist connotations of the word lazy, you don't understand the degree to which racism has infected the collective psyche of the United States of America. This is why it's so important to develop a sense of the way Black people and other communities of color have shaped U.S. history. If you are historically minded, and this is a term that John Hope Franklin used, John Hope Franklin, who is the author of From Slavery to Freedom, an amazing history of Black people in the U.S., then if you are historically minded, you know that charges of laziness have been leveled against Black people as a justification of efforts to deny Black people entrance into key institutions and to deny them economic and political and educational opportunities. And awareness of Black history urges us to reflect on the grave damage that has been done to U.S. society and to begin to imagine ways to undo this damage, to reverse this damage. Within U.S. history, the most persistent impulse to expand democracy, the most relentless thrust toward freedom has come from Black struggles. The struggle for freedom and democracy has been consistently waged by Black people since the first slave rebellion in the 1500s. And I make this point not to boast about Black achievement, but rather to argue that in fighting for Black freedom, Black people have always fought for everyone who believes in the possibility of freedom. And so Black history in the U.S. is the history of the United States.
Yes, it is.
Which is not to say that we can neglect the histories of other subjugated communities, indigenous nations, Latinx communities, Asian American people, Muslims, LGBTQ communities, Asian American people, disabled people. As a matter of fact, we can go back to that notion that if Black lives are ever made to matter in our world, then all lives will matter. And I wanted to say a few words about the fact that Black struggles, Black freedom struggles, have served as inspiration to others. Last year when I was in Northern Ireland, I was in Belfast, and I like to say people were still talking about Frederick Douglass's 1845 visit. And they showed me a mural, a very beautiful mural in Belfast. Palestinian activists were inspired by Black freedom riders a few years ago, the Palestinian activists organized a freedom ride in order to desegregate the highways, the roads, because you know in occupied Palestine, which has a vast Israeli military presence, excuse me, in occupied Palestine, there are roads that lead to settler communities that Palestinians are not allowed to drive on. And so this was a demonstration against the segregation of the highways, and the Palestinian activists call themselves Palestinian Freedom Riders, acknowledging the inspiration by Black freedom riders in the 1960s. And I could talk about the Black Panther Party. Black Panther Party. I could talk about the way in which the Black Panther Party inspired Black Panther parties all over the world. Like there was a Black Panther Party in Israel, in New Zealand, in Brazil, and many other places. I wanted also to say a few words about the way in which the anti-slavery movement inspired the women's movement in this country, because that brings us a little bit closer to home. The 19th century women's suffrage movement was inspired by the anti-slavery movement. Women like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, and many other white women were advocates for an end to slavery. And as a matter of fact, white women working within the anti-slavery movement became conscious of the fact that they were also treated as inferior beings, and they therefore began to stand up for women's rights as well as for the liberation of enslaved people. But when they formulated their demands, they forgot. They didn't, even though someone like Frederick Douglass was the most prominent male advocate of female suffrage at the time, they did not think about including Black women or other women of color in their demands. This is why Sojourner Truth gave that famous speech in 1851, "Ain't I a woman?" And it seemed like in the 1960s, almost a century later, when the women's liberation movement emerged, women of color, working class white women were still saying, "Ain't I a woman?" And 50 years after that, we still have to point out that we are an integral part of the women's movement, and that women of color have pioneered many of today's gender struggles.
Right.
So we have to constantly point out that in 2006, Tamara Burke had gathered a community on MySpace under the rubric Me Too. We have to point out that Black women blues singers were singing about sexual harassment and sexual abuse in the 1920s, before the women's liberation movement organized the many speak outs in which women, mostly white women, made it public that they had been victims of abuse. Now, My time is almost up. But I did want to point out that just as we think about struggles for freedom as being collective struggles, we should also think about these current movements and efforts to begin to eradicate what is the most pandemic form of violence in the world, which is gender violence, violence against women.
Yes.
We have to begin to think of them as collective struggles as well. There is the tendency still in the 21st century to assume that all of these men who have been engaging in abuse and assault are simply bad men, and that they need to go to prison or whatever, or they don't need to be in the White House. That would be a good thing. But they thought about individually. They thought about as individuals who have flaws. And I'm including the current president in that analysis. If we think about the fact that sexual abuse was an integral element of slavery, perhaps we recognize that wherever there are hierarchically organized human relations, sexual dominance plays a role in maintaining that hierarchy. During the feudal era, the feudal lord had the right to sleep with every serf woman who was married on the first night. So to sleep with the bride, it was simply called the right of the first night. So the feudal lord had the right of the first night, and that bolstered his power. Slave owners' assertion of sexual dominance over black women. And of course, sexual abuse was an integral element of slavery, as evidenced by many of us walking around today with light skin. We are the historical evidence of that violence.
Tell it.
But I bring up slavery because I think it's important to think about institutions, not only about individuals. If sexual violence is so widespread today, it is because there is widespread complicity. It is because it has been institutionalized. So how do we begin to understand this complicity, the structures of sexual violence, as opposed to simply focusing on punishing the individual who commits the violence? Of course, the one individual will be punished and 10 more will take his place. The one individual will be punished and will go into a prison that is structured in accordance with violence. And so when he is released, he'll probably be a person who is even more violent than when he went in. So and that's an abolitionist argument. That's one of the arguments we use when we talk about abolishing prisons. When we understand the deep connection between sexual harassment and assault of the kind that has been in the news and on social media lately, and on trans women, we understand something deeper about the nature of violence. Black trans women constitute the community that is most subject to violence in this country. Institutional violence, individual violence. When are we going to begin to bring attention to this violence? What I've been talking about this evening is just the beginning of important stories within Black history. Even as Black history is marginalized, these are marginalized stories within. And so I think I want to conclude by asserting that it is often those who are most marginalized, those who are most subjugated, who best represent our most radical historical possibilities. Thank you very much.
Someone might be able to grab them for you. This is going to be a shorter version of a Q&A. Okay, so do you think Black people in America should be more or less concerned with creating our own liberated spaces than assimilating into white ones?
Interesting question. Well, these are two different mics. You know, I think we need everything. I think we need liberated spaces. You know, maybe Black liberated spaces, my sense has been that the strongest political movements are created by those who develop a political identity and not simply based on something that is given. Because, you know, you could get a bunch of Black people over here and you may discover that you've got some Black conservatives, you got some Black misogynists, right? So I think, is this working or is it breaking up? So I think non-assimilation is good, but when I say non-assimilation, I mean non-assimilation into the politics and economics of the status quo. As a matter of fact, I really think we need to reflect on what it means to develop non-assimilationist demands. Because that's really what my talk was kind of about as well. And given that on university campuses we have become so accustomed to these buzzwords like diversity and inclusion. I know that the Office of Diversity and Inclusion has invited me to come. But I think we also have to learn how to be critical of the very terms that we use, even as we use them.
There you go. There you go.
So that we end up doing the thinking ourselves, as opposed to having those terms do the thinking for us. And the reason I think we need to be critical of diversity is because diversity doesn't always get it. And oftentimes diversity is designed to allow the machine to function in exactly the same way.
Go ahead, there you go.
You know, you have some Black peoples and Latinos and so forth and so on. Same thing with inclusion. You know, if you don't change the system, if you don't change the structure, you know, what good is it to be included in a race society? You know, for women to be incorporated into it's not.
Like she might be out just on the south side.
Okay, should I say that again? You know, I would say we talk about inclusion. You know, what good is it to be included in a society that remains just as racist as it was before? Or why include women in a framework that remains just as misogynist as it was before the women got included? So, I think what we should be talking about is radical change, revolution even, structural change.
Do you have any advice on being a Black woman in corporate America?
Yeah, I think it's an important question because it actually speaks to what I was just saying. The idea is that if you get more diversity and more inclusion, so your role would be to make sure the machine does not function as smoothly as they expect. So I think that people can do work wherever they are. I don't think you have to say you've got to leave this job or leave this place in order to do important activist work. You can do that work wherever you are. And we definitely need people strategically placed in corporate America who are willing to mess the machine up.
Can we use universities and the degrees they confer to liberate ourselves and our peoples when these institutions were founded on ideas that excluded and subjugated us?
Well, that's certainly true, that these institutions all have racist and class-based histories, absolutely. And not just histories. But I think education is really important. It's important to be in a place like this university. But I think that even as we learn, we should be critical. We should adopt a critical stance. And what does that mean? It means thinking not only about the object of your thought, whatever it is, you know, whether you're reading a book or talking about, but it means reflecting also on the conceptual tools that you use to try to understand whatever it is. You know, many people fail to recognize that that it's the problem resides in that which we take for granted, that which we never think about. And this is true in terms of what you're studying, the disciplinary categories that you use. If you're working within a discipline, don't simply internalize, you know, all of the theories and methods that you're offered. Be critical of them. I mean, I personally think that interdisciplinary approaches are better because they kind of force you to think about your conceptual tools as well as your object. Yeah, I think education is important. But don't let the institution persuade you that this is the only important knowledge in the world. Knowledge gets produced in many different sites, many different venues. Knowledge gets produced in prison. I mean, if you look at the brothers and sisters behind bars, and if you see Michelle Jones, Google Michelle Jones, who just got out of prison and is a graduate student now at NYU. Look at the research that she did when she was in prison in Indiana, the first women's prison, founded in 1870. But anyway, that would be another lecture. Don't let these elite institutions persuade you that you are better. Especially those of you who come from communities where going to college is not a normal thing. Don't let the institution convince you that you are better than those you left behind. They produce knowledge as well in a different way. You just do it in a professionalized setting. That's all there is. But sometimes the most important knowledge comes from non-professional venues and frameworks. As a matter of fact, there is a relatively new field that's called critical prison studies. That would not have been possible were it not for the contributions of people in prison. Prisoners did the intellectual work that lies at the very basis of that new field, critical prison studies.
What was the first experience that allowed or inspired you to become an activist?
No, long before the Black Panthers. Sorry about that. I was kind of lucky that I didn't have to make a choice. It was just those who did not become activists and assented to the definitions of black people. I grew up in segregated, I think I told you that already. I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama, during the time of the Ku Klux Klan and Bull Connor and bombs and house burnings and all of that. And my mother was an activist. And I often point out that my mother trained us to be activists, I now realize, by reminding us over and over again that the conditions under which we were living were not supposed to be that way.